Marian counted the coins in her pocket, her heart sinking as the last bus of the night hissed past, disappearing into the gray curtain of the downpour. The freezing rain had already conquered her thin blouse, and her phone, her only lifeline, had flickered out moments ago, a victim of the moisture. She clutched her apron closer to her chest, the few tips from her double shift feeling like a mockery against the final notice medical bill for her mother's treatment tucked into her bag. The debt felt heavier than the water-soaked fabric on her skin, threatening to pull her under the rising tide of her own life. The shortcut through the warehouse district was a gamble, but the prospect of a 5-mile walk in this weather was a slow death. Marian ducked beneath a rusted awning to catch her breath when a flash of color in the gutter stopped her. It was a bright crimson ribbon, attached to a school uniform that looked far too expensive for this part of the city. Crouched behind a row of overflowing dumpsters, she found her. A young girl, no more than 6, curled into a shivering knot. The child's skin was a frightening, waxy pale, and her breathing came in ragged, wheezing gasps that Marian's nursing training immediately identified as a severe allergic reaction. Her eyes, wide and unfocused with delirium, locked onto Marian's with a primal terror. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you," Marian whispered, her voice barely carrying over the drum of the rain. The girl couldn't speak. Her throat was clearly closing. Marian's mind raced through the dangers. A wealthy child, alone and dying in a syndicate-controlled alley. This wasn't an accident. It was a crime. The responsible choice was to find a payphone and call the police. But the nearest station was miles away, and this child didn't have minutes, let alone hours. Looking into the girl's glassy eyes, Marian saw the same vulnerability she saw in her mother every night. In that moment, Marian made a decision that would shatter the quiet struggle of her life and thrust her into a war she wasn't prepared for. She scooped the limp, fragile body into her arms, tucked the girl's head beneath her chin to keep her warm, and began to run toward her apartment. The heavy, wet silence of the apartment was broken only by the frantic rhythm of Marian's breathing and the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of Minji's struggling lungs. Marian laid the girl on her scarred wooden kitchen table, the yellow light of the overhead bulb flickering as if sensing the crisis. The child's face was no longer pale. It was swelling, a mottled purple hue creeping up her neck as her airway began to fail. Marian's hands shook as she tore through her medical bag, a second-hand kit she kept for her mother's emergencies. She found it at the bottom, a single, precious auto-injector of epinephrine. It was her last one, the backup she had sacrificed an entire week's worth of groceries to buy, but there was no time for a cost-benefit analysis. "Stay with me, Minji," Marian whispered, her voice a cracked plea. She braced the girl's thigh with one hand and slammed the injector into the muscle. The mechanical click echoed in the small kitchen like a gunshot. Marian held it there, counting the seconds, watching the girl's chest for the slightest sign of expansion. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, ragged gasp tore through Minji's throat. The whistle softened into a deep, desperate shudder. As the medicine began its work, Marian moved with mechanical precision. She grabbed a clean towel to dry the girl's hair and wrapped her in her mother's thickest wool blanket. She was so focused on the pulse point at Minji's neck, feeling the rapid, thrumming beat of life returning, that she almost missed the sound from the hallway. It wasn't the sound of a neighbor. It was the heavy, synchronized tread of boots on old linoleum, moving with a lethal lack of hesitation. Marian froze, her hand still resting on Minji's forehead. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the window, but inside, the air had turned cold and electric. Through the thin wood of her front door, she heard the low, metallic slide of a weapon being readied. She looked down at the girl. Minji's eyes were partially open now, glassy but conscious, tracking Marian's face with a confusion that was rapidly turning into recognition. The child tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. Marian pressed a finger to her own lips, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had saved the girl from the storm and the sickness, but as the shadows of men moved past her door's frosted glass, Marian realized the true danger was only just beginning. She wasn't just a waitress in a rainy city anymore. She was the only thing standing between the dragon's daughter and the wolves at the door. She stood up, reaching for a heavy cast-iron skillet, the only weapon she owned, just as the first heavy blow struck the door frame, making the entire apartment shudder. The door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The aging wood groaned and splintered inward, the frame yielding to a violent, calculated force that sent a shiver through the floorboards. Marion flinched, her fingers tightening around the cold handle of the cast-iron skillet, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. Minji was behind her, her small hand still clutching Marion's hem with a strength born of pure terror. Two men in charcoal gray suits filled the narrow entryway, their silhouettes sharp against the flickering hallway light. They moved with a predatory efficiency, barrels of suppressed weapons sweeping the room for threats. Behind them stepped a third man. He wore no tactical gear, only a dark, bespoke suit that seemed to repel the rain still dripping from his shoulders. His face was a mask of tempered steel, his eyes dark, cold, and lethal, locked instantly onto his daughter. Minji, the man breathed, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of a death sentence. He moved toward the table, his stride radiating a terrifying, unchecked power. The guards flanked him, their muzzles centering on Marion's chest. The air in the kitchen turned suffocating, thick with the scent of wet pavement and gun oil. "Get away from her," the man commanded, his English perfect but edged with a razor-sharp threat. Marion felt the adrenaline surge, a hot spark of defiance in the face of her own mortality. She didn't drop the skillet. Instead, she shifted her weight, further shielding the girl who was now beginning to tremble again. "Keep your voice down," Marion snapped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause. The guards looked to the man in the center, their fingers tensing on their triggers, waiting for the signal to erase her. Kim Jo-sun's eyes narrowed, his brows drawing together in a flicker of genuine shock. No one spoke to the dragon like that. No one survived it. "She's just had a massive dose of epinephrine and her heart rate is dangerously high," Marion continued, her voice trembling but firm, the nurse in her overriding the waitress. "The last thing she needs is a man screaming and dragging her into the cold. If you're her father, start acting like you care about her blood pressure more than your ego." Jo-sun stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, the gold chain at his neck glinted under the flickering bulb, and the raw intensity of his gaze was nearly physical. He looked at Marion, at her soaked blouse, her trembling hands, and the empty auto-injector lying on the table, and then he looked at his daughter. Minji's eyes were wide, fixed on her father, but she didn't reach for him. She reached for Marion. "Emmy?" the girl croaked, the name a fragile thread in the tense room. The lethal mask on Jo-sun's face cracked. For a fleeting second, the dragon vanished, replaced by a father gripped by a crushing, silent relief. He looked back at Marion, his expression shifting from murderous intent to a profound, calculating curiosity. He saw the final notice bill on the counter, the mismatched furniture, and the young woman who was ready to fight an army with a frying pan to protect a child she didn't know. "You saved her," he stated, his voice now a low, dangerous silk. It wasn't a question. It was an observation that would change the trajectory of Marion's life forever. Jo-sun reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying not to startle a wounded animal. He didn't take Minji immediately. Instead, he brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead, his thumb lingering against her skin to verify the coolness Marion had promised. The silence in the kitchen was no longer violent, but it remained heavy, charged with the kinetic energy of a man who bought and sold lives for breakfast. "Ramon," Jo-sun said, not looking away from his daughter. One of the suited men stepped forward, placing a sleek, heavy briefcase on the cluttered kitchen counter, right atop the final notice bill that had been haunting Marion's dreams. Jo-sun finally turned his gaze to Marion. The intensity was different now, less like a predator, more like a master jeweler inspecting a rare, unpolished stone. "You have talent, Miss Chin, and more importantly, you have a spine." My daughter has seen 3 specialists this month. None of them realized she had developed a late-onset allergy to the cedar oils in her new school's library. You saw it in a rainstorm. Marian leaned against the sink, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I didn't do it for a performance review. She was dying. Precisely, Jo-sun said. He gestured to the briefcase. Inside is $50,000. Consider it a retainer. I am offering you a position as Minji's primary medical guardian. $10,000 a week, plus room and board at my estate. I will also ensure your mother is moved to a private facility with the best pulmonary specialists in the country. Marian's breath hitched. The figure was astronomical, more money than she would have seen in 5 years of waitressing. It was the answer to every prayer she had whispered over her mother's hospital bed. But as she looked at the 2 men still standing by the shattered door, their hands never straying far from their holsters, the golden glitter of the offer began to dim. "Why me?" she asked, her voice steadying. "You could hire a team of world-class doctors with that money." Jo-sun stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the linoleum until it swallowed her feet. "Doctors follow protocols. They stay in hospitals. They don't carry children through slums in the middle of a typhoon. They don't stand down armed men with a kitchen utensil." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous whisper. "The people who took Minji tonight didn't want a ransom. They wanted a message. They will try again. My guards are trained to shoot. They are not trained to heal. I need someone who stays by her side when the bullets start flying. Someone the world won't notice until it's too late." The realization hit Marian with the force of a physical blow. The high salary wasn't just for her nursing degree. It was hazard pay. She wasn't being hired to simply dispense medicine in a quiet room. She was being hired to be the last line of defense, a human shield wrapped in a nurse's uniform. She looked at Minji, who was watching her with wide, pleading eyes, her small hands still reaching out as if Marian was the only solid thing left in a world made of smoke and mirrors. Marian looked at the briefcase, then at the door that could no longer be locked. She was an invisible waitress 1 hour ago. Now she was about to become the most important piece on a lethal chessboard. "I have conditions," Marian said, lifting her chin. Jo-sun's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. "I expected nothing less. Pack your things, Miss Chin. Your new life begins before the sun rises." The transition from the salt-stained linoleum of Marian's kitchen to the polished obsidian floors of the Kim estate felt like crossing into a different dimension. The mansion sat atop a jagged cliff overlooking the sea, a fortress of glass and steel that hummed with a low-frequency tension. Here, every movement was monitored by silent, unblinking cameras, and every hallway was patrolled by men who moved like shadows. Marian felt like a jagged stone dropped into a still, frozen lake. In her worn jeans and a borrowed sweater, she was a glaring anomaly against the minimalist perfection of the household. The staff, mostly elderly Korean women with faces as unreadable as stone tablets, moved around her with a polite but chilling distance. They spoke in hushed, rapid Korean, their eyes sliding over her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. To them, she wasn't a savior. She was a variable they hadn't accounted for, a Westerner, with no place in their ancient, hierarchical structure. The rigidity of the house was stifling. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 a.m. in a dining room so large their voices echoed. Jo-sun sat at the head of the table, usually shielded by a wall of digital tablets and security reports, barely acknowledging Marian's presence except for a sharp, assessing glance to check Minji's vitals. It was in the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the tutors and the piano instructors finally departed, that the ice began to thin. Marian found Minji sitting on a balcony that overlooked the crashing waves, her small face pressed against the glass. The girl looked less like a princess and more like a prisoner. "It's too big," Minji whispered, not turning around. "My house before had a garden with real dirt. Now everything is just stone." Marian sat on the floor beside her, ignoring the proper chair nearby. "I know. My apartment was so small I could touch both walls if I stretched, but it smelled like my mama's ginger tea. This place smells like nothing, just air. Minji finally looked at her, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded expression. Your mama is sick too? Like mine? The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Marian nodded slowly. She is. That's why I learned how to be a nurse. I wanted to be the person who stayed awake when she was scared. Who did that for you, Minji? The girl's lip trembled. Nobody. Papa says we have to be strong. He says crying is for people who want to lose. But sometimes at night, I forget how to be strong. Being strong doesn't mean you don't feel the cold, Marian said softly, reaching out to take the girl's small, pale hand. It just means you keep walking through it. My mama used to tell me that even the stars have to deal with the dark to shine. Minji leaned her head against Marian's shoulder, a hesitant, desperate gesture of trust. In that moment, the grand architecture and the armed guards outside the door faded away. They weren't a mafia heiress and a hired nurse. They were just two daughters missing pieces of their hearts. Marian realized then that Jo-sun's money could buy the best medicine in the world, but it couldn't buy the one thing Minji actually needed to heal. Someone who wasn't afraid to be human in a house built of glass and steel. The stillness of the Kim estate had always felt artificial, but by the seventh night, it felt predatory. Marian sat in the monitoring nook adjacent to Minji's suite, a space she had claimed to keep a medical eye on the girl's nighttime respiratory patterns. Rows of high-definition screens flickered with the blue-gray light of the perimeter cameras, showing the salt-sprayed cliffs and the silent, stone-faced guards at their posts. It was 2:14 a.m. when Marian noticed the glitch. On screen 4, a stray tabby cat trotted past the north gate, its tail twitching in a specific, rhythmic flick. Marian blinked, her nursing brain, trained to spot minute irregularities in a heartbeat, registering a sense of localized déjà vu. Exactly 3 minutes later, the same cat trotted past the same gate, the same twitch, the same shadow crossing the same stone. Her blood turned to ice. She wasn't looking at a live feed. She was looking at a loop. Marian stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. She hurried down the hall toward the central security hub, her bare feet silent on the cold obsidian. Inside the hub, Ramon and two other men sat surrounded by banks of monitors, the air thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of stale coffee. The north and west feeds are looping, Marian said, her voice low but urgent. You need to check the hard lines. Someone has bypassed the external sensors. Ramon didn't even turn his head. He adjusted a dial on his console, his expression one of bored condescension. Go back to bed, Miss Chin. The system is encrypted with military-grade software. If there was a breach, an alarm would have triggered 10 minutes ago. I saw the same cat twice, Ramon. To the second. Marian stepped closer, her hand hovering over the desk. I've spent 3 years monitoring vitals. I know when a rhythm is faked. Your military-grade software is lying to you. The other guard let out a short, mocking huff of laughter. The waitress thinks she's a hacker now. Maybe stick to the band-aids and the bedtime stories, yeah? We've got the dragon's safety handled. It's not just the dragon, Marian snapped, her voice rising with a frantic edge. It's Minji. If those cameras are looped, they're already inside the perimeter. Ramon finally looked at her, his dark eyes hard and dismissive. You're jumpy because of the rain. It's a ghost in the machine. Now, get out of my hub before I report you for interfering with security protocols. Marian felt the familiar sting of the invisible woman syndrome, the weight of being dismissed by men who saw her as nothing more than a temporary necessity. She turned on her heel, but she didn't go to her room. She sprinted toward Jo-sun's study at the end of the wing. She didn't knock. She burst through the double doors just as Jo-sun was pouring a glass of amber liquid, his face illuminated by the glow of a single desk lamp. He looked up, his hand freezing over the decanter, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her disheveled hair and bare feet. The cameras, she gasped, pointing toward the hallway. They aren't real. Someone is. The words were cut short by a sudden, violent shudder that rocked the entire mansion. A dull thud groaned from the basement levels, the sound of the backup generators being detonated. Every light in the estate vanished at once, plunging them into a suffocating, absolute darkness. In the sudden silence, the distinct clack of a tactical boot echoed from the balcony just outside the window. Marian felt a hand grip her arm in the dark, pulling her down behind the heavy mahogany desk. "Stay low," Joe Sun's voice hissed in her ear, no longer dismissive, but sharp with the lethal clarity of a man who realized he had ignored the only person telling the truth. The smoke from the estate breach had barely cleared when Joe Sun made the executive decision to move. He didn't trust his walls anymore, nor the men who guarded them. He needed a crowd, a chaotic, pulsing sea of humanity where a single girl could vanish. The Lunar New Year Festival of Lights offered exactly that. Marian felt the transition from the fortress to the street like a physical blow. The air in the city center was thick with the scent of fried ginger, incense, and the sulphurous pop of early firecrackers. Thousands of red lanterns swayed overhead, casting a rhythmic, crimson glow over the surging crowds. Marian walked close to Minji, her hand never leaving the girl's shoulder, her eyes constantly scanning the faces that blurred past. Joe Sun walked 10 paces ahead, his posture stiff, his hand tucked inside his jacket. He looked like a man expecting a bullet, yet trying to appear like a father enjoying a holiday. Ramon and a diminished security detail trailed behind them, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses, looking for the professional threats they were trained to fight. But Marian wasn't looking for professionals. She was looking for the glitches. "Emmy, look, the dragons." Minji pointed toward a massive silken puppet dancing through the intersection. Marian smiled for the girl's sake, but her gaze drifted to the periphery. Stationed near a narrow service alley was a plain white delivery van. It was unremarkable, save for the slight tilt of its suspension and the mud-spattered plates that didn't match the pristine condition of its chassis. Marian's pulse quickened. She had seen that specific dent on the rear bumper 3 days ago, idling outside the estate's north gate just before the cameras had looped. "Ramon," she hissed, catching the guard's arm as he moved to pass her. "The van. 10 o'clock. Ramon barely glanced at it. "It's a delivery vehicle, Miss Chun. Half the city is making deliveries for the festival. Focus on the child." "It's the same one," Marian whispered, her voice tight with a mounting cold certainty. "The plates are different, but the dent is identical. And the driver hasn't looked at the parade once. He's looking at Joe Sun." As if on cue, the van's side door slid open just an inch. Marian saw the dull, matte black finish of a tactical barrel resting on the ledge. The crowd was cheering, the drums of the dragon dance reaching a deafening crescendo that would swallow the sound of a suppressed shot. She didn't wait for Ramon to verify. She didn't wait for Joe Sun to give an order. "Minji down." Marian lunged, her weight slamming into the girl, driving them both toward the stone base of a nearby fountain. The air above them didn't crack with a bang. It hissed with the lethal thwip of high-velocity rounds. The stone beside Marian's head exploded into dust, shards of granite stinging her cheek. The dragon puppet collapsed as the performers beneath it scrambled for cover. The festive cheers turned into a jagged, communal scream that tore through the night. Marian huddled over Minji, her body a shield once again, her heart hammering against the girl's small frame. Through the chaos, she saw Joe Sun spin around, his weapon drawn, his eyes wide with a frantic, raw terror as he searched for his daughter in the surging crowd. "Here!" Marian screamed, her voice barely audible over the rising panic. "She's here!" The ambush had begun, and the Festival of Lights was about to become a slaughterhouse. The air didn't just fill with noise. It shattered. The low hiss of suppressed rounds was instantly replaced by the deafening, rhythmic roar of automatic fire from the delivery van. Glass from the nearby storefronts rained down like crystalline snow, and the red lanterns above were shredded into burning silk confetti. Panic, raw and choral, surged through the plaza as thousands of festival goers became a stampeding tide. "Stay low. Don't look back," Marian shouted over the din, her hand clamped onto Minji's wrist with a grip that left no room for retreat. She didn't look for Joe Sun. She couldn't. She saw him through the smoke, a silhouette of calculated violence returning fire as his security detail was carved apart by the initial volley. Ramon was down, clutching a shoulder, and the gap between them and the assassins was closing. Marion knew the dragon's guards would fight to the death, but they were fighting a war of attrition. She was fighting a war of shadows. Marion pulled Minji toward the mouth of a narrow pedestrian bridge that arched over the canal. The stone was slick with mist and spilled tea, making every step a gamble. Behind them, two men in heavy tactical jackets broke from the crowd, their eyes fixed solely on the small girl in the school uniform. "Emmy, I'm scared," Minji sobbed, her small legs pumping to keep up with Marion's frantic stride. "I've got you. Just a little further." Marion dived into a labyrinth of backstreets she had spent years navigating during her late-night shifts at the diner. These were the veins of the city, narrow, damp, and ignored by the wealthy. She shoved through a hanging rack of drying laundry, the damp sheets slapping against the assassins' faces and buying her 3 precious seconds. She banked left into an alley so narrow their shoulders brushed the brick, then right through a kitchen service entrance that smelled of old grease and charcoal. The sounds of the massacre at the plaza began to fade, replaced by the hollow echo of their own footsteps. But the hunters were persistent. Marion could hear the rhythmic thud-clack of boots hitting the pavement behind them, relentless and gaining. They reached the old stone bridge, a crumbling relic that led to the city's forgotten industrial quarter. Halfway across, Marion stopped. A black sedan had swung around the far corner, its headlights blinding them, cutting off the exit. Behind them, the 2 assassins emerged from the alley, weapons raised. They were trapped between the steel and the stone. Marion looked down at the dark, churning water of the canal 15 feet below. It was freezing, treacherous, and likely filled with debris from the storm. She looked at Minji, whose face was a mask of pure, silent terror. Then she looked at the men closing in, their faces devoid of anything resembling humanity. "Take a deep breath, Minji," Marion whispered, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. "On 3, we're going to fly. Emmy, no. 1, 2. Marion didn't wait for 3. She scooped the girl into her arms, stepped onto the low stone railing, and threw them both into the void. The world turned into a cold, rushing wind for a heartbeat before the black water rose up to swallow them whole. The canal water was an icy, suffocating weight that dragged at Marion's lungs, but her grip on Minji never wavered. They surfaced in the shadows of a rotting pier, gasping for air that tasted of salt and old iron. Marion hauled the shivering girl onto the moss-slicked stones of a service crawlway, her own body shaking so violently she could barely find her footing. They were miles from the estate, drenched and hunted, hidden in the lightless veins of the industrial district. "Emmy, I'm cold," Minji whispered, her teeth chattering in a rhythmic, terrifying staccato. Marion stripped off her own soaked-over shirt, wrapping it around the girl despite the biting wind. She was searching her memory for the nearest safe house when the low growl of an engine vibrated through the alley. A single black SUV, its headlights extinguished and its body riddled with bullet holes, skidded to a halt at the alley's mouth. The door swung open, and Jo-sun stumbled out. His bespoke suit was shredded, his face a mask of dried blood and soot. He moved with a heavy, hitching gait, one hand pressed firmly against his side where a dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his white shirt. "Minji," he gasped, his voice a ghost of its former command. The girl flew into his arms, and for a moment, the dragon collapsed against the brick wall, his eyes closing in a relief so profound it looked like agony. But as he tried to lift her, his knees buckled. Marion was there in a second, her shoulder catching his weight before he hit the pavement. "Sit down. Now," Marion commanded, her voice regaining the sharp, clinical edge that had first stunned him in her kitchen. She guided him to a stack of rusted crates, the setting a grim mirror of the rainy alley where she had first found his daughter. The roles had shifted, but the stakes remained life and death. Using a discarded piece of clean tarp and the small emergency kit she'd never stopped carrying, Marion began to work. She ignored the sirens in the distance and the trembling of her own hands, focusing only on the jagged entry wound in his abdomen. "You should have left her," Joe-sun wheezed, his head lolling back against the cold brick as Marion applied pressure. "My men. They were supposed to be the shields. You were just a nurse. Your men are dead or scattered." "Gabriel?" Marion snapped, using the name she'd seen on his private documents. "And your daughter is alive because I didn't follow your protocols." "I followed her." She tore a strip of fabric to bind the wound, her movements sure and steady in the dim light. Joe-sun watched her, really watched her, as she murmured reassurances to Minji while simultaneously saving his life. He saw the bruises on her arms from the fall and the blood on her cheek from the granite shards. He had spent his life surrounded by iron-willed men and professional killers, believing that mercy was a luxury the powerful couldn't afford. But as he looked at this young woman, who had jumped into a freezing canal for a child who wasn't hers, he realized he had been wrong. Her softness, her capacity for empathy, and her refusal to see Minji as a pawn wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon more effective than any bullet he had ever fired. It was the only thing that had brought them home. "I underestimated you," he whispered, his hand reaching out to cover hers, his touch no longer a command, but a plea. "I thought I was buying a nurse. I didn't realize I was finding a heart." The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate was no longer cold. It was gold, hitting the obsidian floors with a warmth that felt like a benediction. Marion stood by the balcony, watching Minji chase a butterfly through the newly planted garden. Real dirt, real flowers, and no cameras looping the footage. The girl's laughter was the only music the house needed. A footstep sounded behind her, steady and rhythmic. Joe-sun approached, his side still bandaged beneath a soft linen shirt, the sharp edges of his tailored suits replaced by something more approachable, more human. In his hand, he carried a single, cream-colored folder, the original contract Marion had signed in her rain-slicked kitchen weeks ago. Without a word, he walked to the marble fireplace and dropped the document into the embers. Marion watched as the ink and paper, the $10,000 a week, the human shield clauses, the clinical terminology of their arrangement, curled into black ash and vanished up the chimney. "The contract is dead," Joe-sun said, his voice a low, resonant calm. "You were never just a nurse, Marion, and I am tired of living in a world where everything has a price tag attached to its throat." He stepped closer, standing beside her as they both watched Minji. "The Park Syndicate is dismantled. The business I ran is being transitioned into legitimate commerce, logistics, medical tech, things that build rather than break. I am stepping out of the shadows, but I cannot do it alone." Marion looked at him, searching the dark depths of his eyes for the dragon she had first feared. He was gone. In his place was a man who had finally realized that power without a purpose was just a slow-acting poison. "Your mother has been moved to the Harrison Institute," Joe-sun continued, his hand finding hers on the railing. "The specialists say she'll be walking within the month. Her care is secured for life, not as a payment, but as a gift to the woman who raised a daughter with your courage." Marion felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of years of final notice bills and double shifts finally lifting from her chest. "And what about my life, Gabriel? What happens now that the contract is ash?" Joe-sun turned to her, his expression one of profound, quiet intensity. "I'm offering you a new destiny, not as an employee and not as a shield. I want you to stay as the matriarch of this house, a co-guardian to Minji, and a partner to me as I build a future she won't have to hide from." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box, but he didn't open it yet. "In my world, everyone was a pawn. In yours, everyone has a soul. I want to live in your world, Marion. If you'll have me." Marion looked down at Minji, then back at the man who had traded his empire for a heart. She thought of the waitress who had missed the bus in the rain and realized that woman was a stranger now. The rain had washed away the struggle, and the fire had burned away the fear. She reached out, her fingers interlacing with his, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look back at the shadows. "I think," Marion whispered, a slow, radiant smile breaking across her face, that we have a lot of work to do. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment with where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel, and share this video, as your support is essential for me to continue creating content. See you in the next video.